The main offensive skill for this build is Shattering Concoction. In combination with Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder, this build is really satisfying to play, as it has an insane initial hit and AoE damage. I think the sound effect for Shattering Concoction is one of the best in the game, which makes it even more gratifying to play. Now, Shattering Concoction is one of the different active skills you can choose from in the Pathfinder Ascendancy tree. It consumes your mana flask charges on use, so it's important that we have enough charges at any given time, but we'll look closer into that later in this video. Shattering Concoction also has a high base crit chance of 10%, which is impossible to not take advantage of. And what's even better is that this skill is already available from the first Ascendancy trial, so you can play most of the final build setup from very early in the game. For clearing, this is a one-button build where we only use Shattering Concoction. For more area of effect, we have both the Herald of Ice and Thunder, where we want to shock and deal as much lightning damage as possible with Herald of Ice to in turn trigger Herald of Thunder. We do the reverse with Herald of Thunder, where we want to freeze and deal cold damage to enemies to further trigger Herald of Ice again. This way they have good synergies with each other and end up doing immense damage back and forth. We further boost the Herald damage greatly from the Coming Calamity passive node and also by having increased Herald damage on some of our passive tree jewels. Since Shattering Concoction does cold damage, it can be hard to get enough lightning damage to trigger Herald of Thunder, and this is why we ideally want some added lightning damage on our items. For the quiver, this tends to be very expensive, but it should be cheaper to get it on your gloves or rings. To combat this lack of lightning damage or boost it even further, we are running Cast on Freeze with Voltaic Mark. This will increase our lightning damage output, thus triggering Herald of Thunder more frequently. Now for bosses, we also use Shattering Concoction as our main offensive skill, but with some spice. First of all, before we approach the boss, we switch Cast on Freeze with Alchemist's Boon. This way we gain flask charges passively throughout the fight. If you use Shattering Concoction early on before you meet Alchemist's Boon's level requirement, there are a couple of things you can do to sustain flask charges. You could go for the Glow Swarm Ring, which lets your mana flasks gain charges per second with increased mana flask recovery rate. You should also go for the increased flask charges gain modifier on your belt, both the implicit and explicit stat, as well as increased flask charges gained on your passive tree jewels. First, we start by cursing the boss with Hypothermia before we cast Eye of Winter. Now, hits with this skill, apart from dealing damage themselves, inflict critical weakness on the target, giving 0.5% increased base crit chance per stack. This can stack up to 20 times, and with our high crit damage, this will boost our critical hit chance against bosses immensely, thus dealing insane damage. Shattering Concoction is only available for the Pathfinder Ascendancy, so our Ascendancy choice is obvious. Now the first 2 points we use to get the actual skill, so that we can start building around it at an early level. If you play SSF or have just started out in Standard as a new player and you cannot sustain mana flask charges yet, then you could instead use Ice Shot as your leveling offensive skill. This is much easier to build around early on, as you have more flexibility in terms of gear and passive nodes. If you do go for Ice Shot, you can use basic attack on bosses with as much damage output as possible from support gems. Now if you manage to sustain your mana flask charges, then the only mandatory Ascendancy points are the Shattering Concoction node and the Traveler's Wisdom. If you do struggle to sustain your mana flask charges, then go for Connected Chemistry first. If you ever do the final Ascendancy points, then I would personally spend them on the Running Assault node, but this is of less importance. Now, if you've enjoyed this video so far, make sure to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for more upcoming PoE 2 videos. Immediately as we obtain Shattering Concoction, we go all in on critical hit passive nodes. The base crit chance of 10% gives us a great foundation for quickly making this skill a crit monster. Our goal is to get the Shattering Concoction critical hit chance to at least 50% and get as much critical damage bonus as we can from the tree. With this crit chance, even the smaller passive nodes of 15% increased critical damage bonus can give thousands of DPS increases. We also land on 4 dual passive node slots in the tree. For these jewels, we ideally want the following combination of stats: increased flask charges gained, increased attack damage, increased evasion rating, and herald skills deal increased damage. Now, getting all of these 4 modifiers in combination will either cost you a lot of currency with trading or be nearly impossible to get in SSF. So what you need to do is to aim for 3 of these in combination for each duel. The modifier you should try to get for all of them though is the increased flask charges gained, as the highest priority is to ensure we sustain Shattering Concoction. From there you can mix and match the other modifiers on the jewels. This build has an evasion rating of 85% plus, and since we have capped resistances and a decent combined hit points pool with life and energy shield, we leave it at that without going for the acrobatics passive node. The final thing I will mention is that we do get the 2 smaller passive nodes for unarmed attack damage increase, but we do not get the flurry notable node. Even though this node increases the tooltip DPS of Shattering Concoction greatly due to the insane attack speed increase, attack speed is not actually a priority for this build. We don't usually stand around spamming Shattering Concoction in quick succession, but rather keep mobile and focus on fewer greater impacts. This is why scaling damage is much more important than scaling attack speed, and since this node gives us 20% reduced damage, we shy away from taking it. When assembling gear for this build, my main focus has been to make it as cheap as possible without sacrificing too much quality. This way, the build should be obtainable for most players, even for all of you playing SSF. Stick around to the end of this section to see the price labels for each of these items, but first, the potential hardest piece to obtain here is the Widowhail bow, which is mandatory for this build to work. This is because Shattering Concoction does not scale with our weapon damage, so a regular bow won't do it for us. Widowhail rather gives increased bonuses from our quiver, which is why we want +2 level of all projectile scales on that. With the 250 increased bonuses modifier on the bow, this amounts to +7 levels in total. You could get this modifier up to 300%, or even more with corruption, but when you go above 250%, the price drastically increases. As for the sockets on the bow, you should go for this soul core that I cannot pronounce properly, if you ever manage to obtain it. This would increase our damage greatly, but I have not included it in this budget build, since it's expensive and hard to come by. Now let's look at the mana flask. Now the most important stat to get as high as possible here is the gains X charges per second to sustain Shattering Concoction. The main idea for defenses is to go for pure evasion on every piece except for helmet, where we only want energy shield. This is because we go for the Subterfuge Mask passive node, giving us +2 evasion rating per energy shield on the helmet. For the amulet, we want to anoint a node that is just immense for this build, the Barbaric Strength. Now this gives us +45 critical damage bonus, an insane DPS increase. The increased mana cost of skills doesn't really affect us that much, since the only thing using mana in this build is the Cast on Feast buff, and with some mana regen from the gear and the passive tree, we should be able to sustain that. Now an important reason for going for this node on the amulet, apart from it being great for this build, instilling this node requires Distilled Guilt, Despair and Envy. These are quite common drops from Delirium maps, and only cost around 1 exalt each on the current trading market. This aligns with this being a budget and SSF friendly build. Now let's have a look at the price label for each of these items. Just to be clear, I'm not saying you can obtain these items at the same cost, as this varies in terms of market value and timing, but these are the prices I paid for them. This amounts to a total of only 82 exalts for the entire build. Based on the performance of this build, this is insanely low, and think of the possibilities if you want to take this build further with even greater gear. The sky's the limit. Now if you enjoyed this video, you can find similar videos in the description or simply click on this video, and remember to hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for more upcoming videos.